Thank you so much for joining us today on our webinar. We're going to review the identification of schools for improvement. So why do we identify schools for improvement? Well, the Every Student Succeeds Act, also known as ESSA, requires state agencies to determine low-performing schools. Once identified, evidence-based strategies to improve these low-performing schools must be implemented, and states must provide technical assistance and grant funding to assist districts and schools with improvement. Low-performing schools are categorized as either comprehensive support and improvement schools, targeted support and improvement schools, and lastly, additional targeted support. And so to align the identification of schools for improvement with the state's accountability system, so we're not running two different systems at once, the agency utilizes the Closing the Gaps domain. And the Closing the Gaps domain uses disaggregated data to demonstrate differentials among racial ethnic groups, socioeconomic backgrounds, and other factors. So in Texas, a campus may receive only one label when identified for school improvement. So utilizing campus outcomes from the Closing the Gaps domain, the agency first identifies comprehensive support and improvement schools in Texas. Next, those campuses that were not identified for comprehensive support and improvement are evaluated for targeted support and improvement. And then finally, those campuses that were not identified for comprehensive or targeted are evaluated for additional targeted support identification. Again, a campus may only receive one label when being identified as a campus for school improvement. This webinar will review how schools are identified annually for comprehensive, targeted, and additional targeted support. Now, if identified, our Division of School Improvement will intervene with those campuses regarding school improvement plan submissions and tools and trainings and funding. So questions about what happens when I am in comprehensive targeted and additional targeted support are best directed to the Division of School Improvement. The webinar for today is just going to review how schools are identified annually. So let's start off by talking about how we identify campuses for comprehensive support and improvement. As I mentioned earlier, the Closing the Gaps domain scaled score is used to identify schools for comprehensive support and improvement. Now we rank order the scaled domain score for all campuses for comprehensive support and improvement. Specifically, the lowest 5% of campuses that receive Title I Part A funds are identified for comprehensive support and improvement. So in 2019, the Closing the Gap scale score cut point for comprehensive was a 42. Now for 2020, if that changes to 41, or if it remains 42 or goes up to 43, depends on performance across the state. But for reference, in 2019, that scaled score cut point to identify the lowest performing Title I Part A campuses was a 42. This is an example of how it would work for 2020. We would look at all Title I Part A campuses in the state, and then we would rank order their performance, the scaled score performance in the Closing the Gaps domain from highest to lowest. As I mentioned, for reference, in 2019, the cut point for comprehensive identification was 42 and below. So as an example here, all those campuses rank ordered from highest to lowest, we would look at 42 and below. If they received Title I Part A funds, we would identify those campuses that had a 42 Closing the Gaps scaled score in the state, and then rank order those and identify those that were at least the bottom 5% or had a 42 and below scaled score for the Closing the Gaps domain. Okay. Additionally, if a campus does not have at least a 67% four-year federal graduation rate for the all students group, the campus is automatically identified for comprehensive support and improvement. Now, this methodology right now is part of a ESSA plan amendment, and that amendment may change to a 6-year rate. So right before Christmas of 2019, a to the administrator address was sent out to superintendents mentioning that we were amending the state's ESSA plan. One of those amendments was that we wanted to use not a 4-year, but a 6-year federal graduation rate for the all students group when identifying comprehensive support and improvement campuses. We submitted this to the U.S. Department of Education, and we are waiting on a word from them as to whether or not we can use a 6-year rate instead of the 4-year rate. Currently, if a campus does not have at least a 67% 4-year rate, they're identified for comprehensive. We hope to change that to 6-year. At the time of this webinar, we have not heard back from the U.S. Department of Education, but once we hear back from them, we will send out notifications as to whether or not we can use the 6-year rate when identifying campuses for comprehensive support. Just as a reminder, this identification is not tied to the Title I status of a campus. Finally, any Title I campus that is identified for targeted support and improvement for 3 consecutive years will be identified for comprehensive support and improvement the following year. This is also part of a submitted ESSA amendment, and this may change to additional targeted support and improvement for 3 consecutive years. And so part of the change for the state was that instead of identifying targeted support for 3 consecutive years and then escalating to comprehensive, the state would then change to identifying additional targeted support and improvement campuses. If so, for 3 consecutive years, that campus would be escalated to comprehensive. Again, we have not heard back from the U.S. Department of Education at the time of this webinar, but if we hear back from them in the coming weeks, we will send out notifications. But it is likely to be that if any campus is identified for, any Title I campus is identified for additional targeted support for 3 consecutive years, they would then be escalated to comprehensive the following year. We have a to the administrator addressed on December 19th that talks a little bit more about this. Regarding minimum size criteria. So there is no minimum size criteria for comprehensive support and improvement. However, any campus identified for comprehensive that has fewer than 100 students enrolled, as reported on the October snapshot date, is not required to implement interventions associated with the identification. Now, if a campus chooses not to implement interventions, it is not eligible for comprehensive support grant funding. So choosing not to implement interventions does not exit that campus from comprehensive support identification. In order to exit comprehensive support and improvement, a campus must not rank in the bottom 5% of the Closing the Gaps domain for 2 consecutive years and have increased a letter grade. For example, going from an F to a D or a D to a C in the Closing the Gaps domain by the end of the 2nd year. If so, they will be considered as having successfully exited comprehensive support and improvement status. Now, if a campus was identified for comprehensive based solely on the graduation rate below 67%, in order to exit, that campus must have a graduation rate of at least 67% for 2 consecutive years in order to exit. Now, if our ESSA amendment is approved, the 6-year rate will be used instead of the 4-year rate. And that is how we identify comprehensive support and improvement campuses. Next, if a campus is not identified for comprehensive, they may be identified for targeted support and improvement. For targeted, we look at an individual student group performance, and that's monitored through the Closing the Gaps domain. So any campus with 1 or more consistently underperforming student groups is identified for targeted support and improvement. And we define consistently underperforming as a school having 1 or more student group or groups that do not meet the same 3 targets for 3 consecutive years. And campuses are identified annually for this. We started identifying targeted support and improvement campuses beginning in 2019. So this identification is cell specific. Consistently underperforming must be that same student group in the same 3 indicators for 3 consecutive years. For example, we're looking at the white student group. And let's say the white student group misses their target in academic achievement in reading. That's 1 indicator. And then also misses it in academic achievement in math, 2 indicators. And let's say the white student group also misses it in growth in the math subject area, 3 indicators. So if the white student group misses those 3 indicators in 2018, 19, 20 consecutively, then that campus is identified for targeted support and improvement because the white student group missed 3 indicators, achievement in reading, achievement in math, and growth in math for 3 consecutive years. The minimum size criteria. For 2020, and this is new, the all students group is not evaluated for targeted support and improvement. Now, the individual student groups such as African American, white, Hispanic will be evaluated if that student group has 25 reading and math assessment results for evaluation in the academic achievement component. So if a student group does not meet the minimum size in academic achievement, it is not considered when evaluating that campus for identification for targeted. Additionally, the following student groups are not evaluated to identify a campus for targeted support. As I mentioned, all students, former SPED, continuously enrolled, and non-continuously enrolled. So this is an example of the data table when identifying a campus for targeted support and improvement. And this is an example of one particular campus that is identified because of one student group missing 3 indicators for 3 consecutive years. At the very top, we have our student groups evaluated. And you can see that one group in particular, African American in this example, has a 3 with a red box around it, meaning that this one student group missed 3 indicators for 3 consecutive years, so identified the campus for targeted. So African American is the student group that identified this campus for targeted. So let's look at the data. I can see that they missed their target in this example, academic achievement in reading, that's 1. Also in academic achievement math, that's 2. And then the student success component, looking at the STAR data only, that's 3. Remember, this one student group would have to miss 3 indicators for 3 consecutive years. Looking at academic achievement reading, the target was 32 for reading and achievement. They missed it in 18, 19, and 20 with their respective performance in the subject area. They also missed it for 3 consecutive years in mathematics in 18, 19, and 20. And they also missed it in 18, 19, and 20 in the student success component. So one student group, 3 indicators, 3 consecutive years. That one student group has now identified this campus for targeted support and improvement. We annually identify campuses for targeted support and improvement. And we identify student groups with 1 or more consistently underperforming student groups for targeted. So in order to exit, you must not have 1 or more of those student groups that do not meet the same targets for 3 consecutive years. So in order to not be targeted, that student group would have to meet their targets for that year, or in other words, not miss 3 indicators for 3 consecutive years. So we identify comprehensive support and improvement, then we identify targeted support and improvement, and lastly, we would identify additional targeted support and improvement campuses. And so in order to do this, we look at an individual student group's percentage of evaluated indicators met, and we look to see whether or not that is at or below the percentage used to identify that campus for comprehensive support and improvement. Now, identification occurs on an annual basis. And so What did I just say? Well, in other words, so for reference, in 2019, the cut point for comprehensive support and improvement was a closing the gap scaled score of 42 or below, meaning that if a campus was Title I and had a closing the gap scaled score of 42 or below was identified for comprehensive. For additional targeted support, what we would do is we would unscale that 42. Unscaling the 42 equates to a 9 cut point for an elementary raw score and a 4 for a middle high school raw score. Those raw scores are then set as the percentage of indicators that the student group must meet by campus type. So any elementary campus that had a student group that met fewer than 9%, or if you're a middle or high school that had met fewer than 4% of evaluated indicators, would so be identified as additional targeted support. So in other words, any campus that had at least one student group who basically met none of their targets was identified for additional targeted support. For minimum size, the all students group is not evaluated for additional. Also, each remaining student group must have 25 reading and 25 math assessment results for evaluation in the academic achievement component. If a student group does not meet the minimum size in academic achievement, it is not considered when evaluating the campus for additional targeted support. The following student groups are not evaluated to identify a campus for additional targeted support. As I mentioned, the all students group, also former SPED, continuously enrolled, and non-continuously enrolled. This is an example of a campus that was identified for additional targeted supports. And so we're looking at one student group that essentially missed all of the indicators evaluated for that year. And so you can see from the data table, based on the amount of red, we're looking at the SPED student group. And so we see at the top, we see that they had met their targets in 2019, but they had missed their targets in 2020. And so the middle section, indicators evaluated, I can see that the target for this campus was 9% for that student group. SPED met 0% of their targets. They were evaluated on 5 targets or indicators, and they met none of them. So what did they miss? Looking at the middle of the page going down for SPED, they had enough to be evaluated in academic achievement reading, academic achievement math, growth in reading and in math, and the STAR component. That's 5 indicators evaluated. The no's mean that the SPED student group missed their targets for each of those indicators. So 5 indicators evaluated for SPED, 0 met their target, which is a 0% for the SPED student group, meaning that they're below the target of 9%. And so that one student group has now identified this campus as being identified for additional targeted support. To exit, the triggering student group or groups must meet the targets for the academic achievement indicator in both reading and math. Now, if a student group does not meet the minimum size criteria, it will be treated as having met the target for exiting purposes. Additional targeted support identification occurs on an annual basis. And also because of our submitted ESSA amendment and change to the escalation, any additional targeted support identification from 2019 will not carry over to 2020. So as I had mentioned before, we had submitted a number of amendments to our ESSA plan. We submitted those to the Department of Education. We're still waiting to hear back on whether or not those amendments would be approved or not. We hope to have some notification from them sooner than later. But once we receive notification from the Department of Education on their acceptance or denial of our amendment requests, we will send out a notification in a to the administrator address to all superintendents. We'll also publish this as part of our accountability manual that will be released in May. And this is all I have for the identification of campuses for improvement. We have resources on our A through F website. We also have resources on our performance reporting resources website. If you have not done so, please sign up for our weekly performance reporting listserv. You can go to the TEA homepage. At the top right, there's a link in red that says sign up for updates. Our listserv is performance reporting. We send out a newsletter every single Friday where we talk about topics for accountability. You can find additional resources on our performance reporting homepage. We are finalizing our edits to the 2020 Accountability Manual. We recently released the framework of the 2020 manual, or I'm sorry, the 2020 system on our accountability development site for 2020, and you can view that document there. Additionally, we have taper resources available for you. If you have any questions, you can submit an email to us in performancereporting@tea.texas.gov. And we're always available via phone. You can call us at 512-463-9704. Thank you so much for joining us on our webinar today. Our final webinar will be in May when we will talk about CCMR outcomes bonuses. If you have any questions about accountability or 2020 accountability or the identification of schools for improvement, please contact us in performance reporting. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great spring break, and we will see you when you come back.